Hi students. I am Professor Kshitij Bansal. I teach at Jindal Global Law School. We are going to discuss a very interesting, contemporarily relevant module today. It is cyber warfare, asymmetric armed conflict and unpreparedness of IHL. That is international humanitarian law. What will you be learning after listening to this briefing on cyber warfare and its interrelationship with international humanitarian law? You would be getting an overview of the different challenges IHL faces by virtue of new and advanced forms of warfare and their ensuing dilemma to apply IHL rules. By the end of this briefing, you will understand various nuances on the preparedness of IHL when it comes to asymmetric armed conflict. Let us then begin with an introduction to cyber warfare. The scope of warfare today has expanded beyond the conventional methodologies of two or more armies fighting a physical on-the-ground battle with their tanks and guns, killing each other in red blood. Today, warfare has expanded into civilian territories, and the parities to a war are no longer just restricted to states. These new dimensions in warfare have blurred the lines between civilians and soldiers. Modern day combat now usually takes place in an urban environment and is directed towards civilians who should be immune from attacks under international humanitarian law. IHL was laid down to protect the lives of civilians unless they are directly participating in the hostilities. In recent years, there has been an increase in the number of attacks in civilian territories as most non-state actors benefit from it. Non-state parties prefer to have an armed conflict within an urban setting as they provide better support. Also, due to the armed conflicts being asymmetric, as non-state parties are not as well equipped or trained compared to a state's military, it is easier and effective for them to carry out attacks against civilians because of civilians being a soft target. Attacking civilians is a way non-state parties using to overcome the asymmetry they face, and consequently military targets are replaced by the civilian ones. The increased number of conflicts in urban areas has made it difficult to ascertain the legitimate targets, and it becomes difficult to protect civilians as these non-state parties easily blend in with the civilian population. Consider, for example, ISIS waging an asymmetric warfare in the Middle East as of today. Symmetrical warfare is a conflict fought between two states which are of equal military strength. In symmetrical conflicts, it is difficult to ascertain which party will be victorious, and the costs usually outweigh the benefits. Huge amounts of sources and money are put in to create an asymmetry so that in the chance of a war, it can be fought and possibly won. An asymmetric conflict, on the other hand, exists when the parties to an armed conflict significantly differ in the terms of qualitative and quantitative strength, for example, having a military, technological, or economic advantage. This is a broad definition that will lead to the classification of most armed conflicts as either being asymmetric, wherein one party is often stronger from an objective point of view, or being symmetric. According to Thornton, asymmetric warfare is as old as warfare itself and as recent as the last terrorist outrage. We just had it in London. Especially in the last century, conflicts have not only become more complex, but have also become more unequal. As the asymmetry increases within a conflict, the possibility for tactical, operational, and strategic surprise also increases. Asymmetric warfare, as per this paper, can be defined as where the weaker party to an asymmetric warfare conflict as a way to compensate for lacking resources, uses means and methods that are prohibited under IHL. Acts of terror are an integral part and a good example of an asymmetrical war in modern times. In cases like that of the Al-Qaeda, this type of warfare becomes the main war strategy. There are three salient features of the type of warfare used by these groups like Al-Qaeda. Firstly, traditionally accepted methods of warfare which are legal are deliberately rejected in favor, for example, of the hijacking of airlines and their deployment against civilian objects and civilians, if you can recall 9/11 in New York. Secondly, the future aim of these strategies may be to cause even greater loss to human life and to inflict non-military and above all economic damage through the use of prohibited devices such as biological or chemical weapons. Thirdly, these strategies used are no longer confined to a particular territory and there is no geographically circumscribed battlefield. A terrorist act can be committed anywhere and at any time. Another example of asymmetry is the new Iraq war, where the stronger military side tries to secure a rapid victory on the battlefield through the massive use of force, and the weaker party, recognizing the military superiority of its opponent, will avoid open confrontation in a battlefield and compensate for that weakness by asymmetric means, by employing unconventional methods and prolonging the conflict through an undercover war of attrition against its well-equipped enemy. Let us now discuss terrorism as a case study on asymmetry. Attacks carried out by various terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda in various countries were not immediately identified as a war at first. Bush administration claimed that there was a war between the US and Al-Qaeda following the 9/11 attacks. It raised an important question as to whether international humanitarian law applied to the so-called war on terror unleashed by President Bush, as the adversary was not a state any longer, but a non-state entity carrying out transnational warfare with immense amount of attacks on innocent individuals. United Nations Security Council also deemed the 9/11 attacks as armed attacks threatening world peace, thereby implying the existence of a situation similar to a war. Furthermore, it can be considered that there is a state of war that exists as these organizations carrying out attacks operate globally and their use of weapons of mass destruction, or at least threatening to use the weapons of mass destruction, which can take hundreds of lives, is not only a strategy but also a crime. Thereby the situation replicates a scenario which is very similar to that of a full-fledged, professionally conducted war. The members of the Al-Qaeda who carried out 9/11 attacks also engaged in them with the intention to create a state of war. Acts of terrorism are difficult to predict, and it's often difficult to assess the beginning and the end of hostilities. Most terrorist organizations are well structured, with proper hierarchical positions and tasks allocated between them. The war on terror has just driven terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda underground rather than defeat them. Before the 9/11 attacks, they were well established in Afghanistan, primarily along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, which gave it a territorial context, but today its supporters are spread out worldwide and hide among civilians so that they can carry out calculated and targeted attacks against their stronger opponents. By labeling these conflicts with non-state actors as the global war on terror, states try to insinuate that the international community as a whole is involved in a war-like scenario. From this point of view, it is clear that the conflict is between states and non-state entities which operate at both local as well as international levels. and resort to violent acts of terror to achieve their purpose. Technological innovations in warfare would be very, very interesting to talk about at this stage. The rapid increase in technological innovations has led to an increasing disparity between the weak and the strong. But sometimes even the more technologically advanced and militarily stronger side might be defeated by a weaker side by use of asymmetric warfare, in this case using asymmetric means of technological warfare. Since asymmetrical warfare consequentially leads to loss of civilian lives, the contours in the terms of IHL are not clearly defined. As per IHL, states try to keep the civilian casualties to a minimum. The worldwide consensus is that state civilian populations should not be affected by ongoing hostilities. The very problem that arises out of these conflicts is that as non-state actors use asymmetric warfare as their main strategy and capitalize on the state's fear of casualties as a method to win wars. The non-state actors benefit from this fear in different ways. Firstly, if attacks are directed towards civilians, the state can easily be coerced, as the non-state actors know that the state will do anything to save lives of its people. This puts the non-state actor in a more powerful position than it would otherwise have. Secondly, non-state actors know for a certain time limit that a conflict is justifiable within that time limit. A state can only sustain a fight while it has the support, and the non-state actors know that if it loses support, it runs the risk of not being re-elected. Support for the state decreases with the loss of every innocent life, regardless of which side fired. The non-state party, on the other hand, does not really risk losing any of its support, as they're able to create a strong local support for themselves who support these acts. They have relatively nothing to lose. The organizations such as the ICRC have to face the direct humanitarian consequences of asymmetrical warfare, especially civilians affected by indiscriminate and targeted attacks, and the threat to dignity and integrity of persons detained in such contexts. In the new scenario, where the manifestations of war-like situations are barely covered by humanitarian law, institutions are confused. They're bound to be confused when it comes to dealing with such situations. It is crucial for the institutions to be able to combat asymmetrical wars so as to perform those tasks which are in keeping with the basic principles of governing humanitarian relief. It must be able to provide relief impartially and without discrimination to all the victims of hostilities. Weaker parties to a conflict need and take humanitarian relief as long as they do not perceive them to be an entity of the opposite government. Weaker parties need these reliefs many times as it becomes key to their survival. Cyber warfare, after understanding the discussion on asymmetric warfare, would make us understand the specifics of an example to that asymmetric warfare. Limits to IHL would bring in another dimension that has been added to armed conflicts in the modern era, which is cyber warfare. We would now mainly focus on the means and methods of warfare that consist of cyber operations amounting to or those conflicts conducted in the context of an armed conflict within the meaning of IHL, as IHL does not cover all kinds of cyber attacks. Cyber warfare can be deadly as it could lead to civilians being deprived of essentials such as drinking water, medical care, and electricity. Cyber attacks can also interfere with rescue services that save lives or disrupt vital infrastructure such as dams, nuclear plants, and aircraft control systems. The well-being, health, and even lives of hundreds of thousands of people could be affected. One of the ICRC's roles is to remind all parties to a conflict that constant care must be given to spare civilians. Wars have rules and limits that apply to all means and methods of warfare. IHL's application to these new technologies is crucial to identify ways of limiting the potential humanitarian cost of cyber operations in an armed conflict. Warfare has evolved since the Geneva Conventions were drafted in 1949, but IHL continues to apply to all activities conducted by parties in the course of an armed conflict, and it is essential that it is followed. However, there is still a need to develop the law further to ensure it provides sufficient protection to the civilian population. As cyber technologies evolve and their impact is better understood, the main challenge faced in cyber warfare is that there is only one cyberspace, which is shared by both military and civilian users, and everything is interconnected, either in the atmosphere above or meters and meters deep in the sea. The key objective is to ensure that attacks are directed against military objectives only and that civilian population and civilian infrastructure is spared. States need to take extra caution when they are resorting to cyber warfare. Most cyber attacks do not come under the ambit of IHL. Also, as many hackers are civilians, they are protected by IHL and can only be subject to criminal proceedings. However, if hackers do take part directly in the hostilities by carrying out a cyber attack in support of one side in an armed conflict, they lose their protection. Termination of conflict is another complexity faced in cyberspace. Conflict termination is when decision makers on both the sides have agreed to cease hostilities. However, a key issue in implementing such agreements to cease hostilities is not knowing whether the other side is abiding by the negotiated terms, especially in terms of cyber warfare. One party may not be sure whether the other side is honoring a ceasefire in cyberspace, given the risk that one or both sides are likely to be the targets of hostile cyber operations from a third party. In other words, there is a constant background of hostile cyber operations going on all the time, even after the ceasefire comes into operation. Parties determining operations would require each side to keep careful track of its various preparations. Let us now talk about IHL's anachronism. Defying traditional concepts of war is IHL's anachronism. The question of the hour is whether today's IHL is satisfactory when traditional wars have become less common. As Pfaffner puts it, asymmetrical wars do not fit in with either Clausewitz's concept of war, because basically equal parties, or the traditional concept of international humanitarian law. It is debatable whether the challenges of asymmetrical war can be met with the current law of war. If wars between states are on the way out, perhaps the norms of international law that were devised for them are becoming obsolete as well. Technological advancements today have led to the evolution of warfare. The increasing use of drones on the battlefield by the US military is a fine example of such an evolution. The US has foregone many IHL and has begun to use its drone program extensively. Drones are a cheap and effective way for the US to combat the asymmetry they face. But many a times the targets of these drones are not identifiable targets, and this leads to loss of innocent lives. A summation of the framework used by the US to authorize and justify drone strikes was answered by a former Defense Department advisor, Rose Brooks, where she said that the executive branch has the right to kill anyone, anywhere, anytime on earth for secret reasons, based on secret evidence, in a secret process, undertaken by unidentified officials. The legal loopholes that some countries, especially the US, have created to justify their attacks make it difficult to enforce IHL. According to OCL, asymmetric warfare presents challenges to IHL that should be met by revising the treaties concerned. Like any other body of law, the Geneva Conventions have been regularly revised in the light of novel challenges in warfare. In fact, major revisions have occurred about every 25th to 30 years. By that standard, the world is now due for another such reassessment. The IHL's protection in armed conflicts is perhaps more important than ever in today's world. With increasing frequency in insurgencies and terrorist attacks having devastating effects for those affected, there is an urgent need more than ever to develop new laws and instruments to govern these conflicts. Till the time such instruments come into existence, it would be a good idea for states to come together voluntarily and unite against the violence being perpetrated against poor, innocent civilians. I think I can summarize by saying that this module mainly teaches us about the new kinds of warfare that have broken the traditional roles that wars used to play. With the instance of state and non-state actors to conflict, the warfare has turned asymmetrical in nature. The applicability of the same to IHL, outdated norms and principles has led to a legal perplexity to handle new advanced and technological forms of warfare such as drone warfare, bioterrorism, use of destructive missiles, and question the ability and ethicality of armed intervention that have involved the same and violated the rights of civilians and the state. I hope this discussion has introduced you to this interaction between asymmetric and symmetric warfare and their interaction then with the IHL's principles. Thank you.